I'm Julie Morita. I'm the commissioner for the Chicago Department of Public Health, and I'm also the co-chair of the Leadership Council for the Elevated Chicago. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Elevated Symposium. I'm particularly excited about this symposium because strategic community development can have such a profound impact on health. In public health, there's an often repeated and perhaps overused quote. I'm sure people in this room are very familiar with it, but I'm going to say it again anyway. When it comes to your health, your zip code matters more than your genetic code. What that means is that your individual health outcomes are influenced more by your neighborhood and the opportunities and resources that are available to you than anything else, even your family medical history. That's why 3 years ago, we at the city and our partners embarked on a bold journey on an elevated train to correct this. And we launched Healthy Chicago 2.0, a 4-year plan that's focused on addressing health equity by directing our attention and our resources to those with the greatest need. We also sought to address the causes of health, the root causes of health, including economic development, housing, transportation, education, and discrimination. This work requires traditional and non-traditional partners to combine forces to make deep change together. And today, it's my pleasure to introduce one of those non-traditional public health partners, Justin Garrett Moore. Justin is an urban designer and executive director of the New York City Public Design Commission, where he focuses on fostering accessibility, diversity, and inclusion in the city's public buildings, spaces, and art. Justin has an impressive background and has had a dynamic career. You are in for a real treat today. And I don't want to stand in the way of you enjoying our speaker. But before he takes the stage, I do want to bring it back to how Justin's work really impacts public health. While conducting my online research of Justin, I found an interview where he discussed how recognizing the link between human, social, and economic change, which impacts health, and the natural and built environment influence his thinking about urban design, planning, and development. This type of thinking and approach to urban design is exactly what is needed to result in more equitable development and ultimately improved health for all. Please join me in welcoming Justin to the stage.
All right. Mic's working? Everyone can hear? All right. Good afternoon. Thank you, Julie and Roberto, for the introduction and the invitation to share some of my work with all of you. I'm already inspired by the work that's happening here in Chicago and really the conversation around connecting people, place, and process, especially. It's very difficult and challenging work to get out of sort of the collective mess that is American cities. Is this working? It's the other direction. That's very counterintuitive. So this idea of working in the city is something I'm going to share with you a few different, what I call hats that I wear. Working in government, working really in community and grassroots, and then really working as a professional that's working and connected to cities. So my primary hat is working, as Julie mentioned, as the head of the New York City Design Commission. This is a part of New York City government that's responsible for oversight of our public built environment. And in that work, we really are having a lot of different goals, right? Our goal is to have a great city, but what does that mean to have a great city? So we talk about principles, kind of our shared objectives. We talk about having great places, right? A sense of place, communities. We talk about equity, the idea that cities are for people, and most cities have a lot of different kinds of people, and we have to understand what that is and what that means for different populations. But then this is where it gets into the nitty-gritty, is why are we doing this and how do we do it? A lot of details have to be figured out and worked out. We want affordable housing. Well, what is affordable housing? That's a detail that you need to figure out. Comfort is the other objective that we talk about a lot. Working with people and working with environments, you have to figure out how do you make people comfortable? How do you make it feel like the place is for them? So how we accomplish that is by looking at a lot of what we call scales of environment, scales of development and quality. So that can be city scale, so like you're doing, looking at transit-oriented development and growth corridors and opportunities. But it also can mean looking at the scale of neighborhoods and buildings and really understanding what the character and fabric of a place is so that you can think about how it needs to be maintained, but also how does it change and how does it grow. And finally, and this is something the designer in me is really especially interested in, the scale of human experience. How does a place look, feel, and operate so that the city can function at its best? Uh-oh. I'm having difficulty here. Okay. So this is sort of where I sit within government. So those of you that ever work with the city government, love this. This is the organization chart for the city of New York. 300,000 people work for the city of New York. The mayor, well, the people are at the top, then the mayor, and then all the different agencies and departments. And there I am outlined in pink. That's me, the design commission. And the outlined here are all of the different agencies and departments that have some kind of touch point, control, decision-making around a built environment. So outlined here are the police department, the transportation department, all the different agencies that are making the city and building the city constantly. But this is the problem that you all know, right? Silos. Everyone is kind of working, doing their thing, doing their job, and we don't necessarily, what I call, connect the dots. So these are the dots. But then this is what people really see and experience, right? They see their city, their neighborhood. There are a lot of different dots that make up our built environment. This could be the small business services helping to grow small and local businesses. Sorry. Whoa. Oh, you're just doing it from here? Okay, so go back to that slide. So here. So all the different businesses and services that make up the neighborhood are really key, and to get people to understand where their independent decisions are connecting to make an environment or a situation. Next. So what we've done in New York City government is what we call the Neighborhood Planning Playbook. The reason that we did this is that we understood that a lot of different decisions are being made that were not actually providing equitable outcomes for people. There wasn't enough awareness or interest or involvement in the processes. So what we did is we got all those different agencies and their silos together and outlined what were their processes that affected how neighborhoods were changing so that we could better align them in our process. So that was turned into this sort of generic kind of framework. So we start with organizing information, learning about a problem or a community or context, and then starting to talk about creating different solutions, right? So there's this process of upfront collaboration that happens. Next. Next. So this is a famous quote that you probably all know. Jane Jacobs, cities have the capability of providing something for everybody only because and only when they are created by everybody. Next. And so what we embedded into this process is this sort of lower register that we call the engagement focus. Before you move on and do new work, there's the importance of going and making sure that you've done the work to talk to people, to learn from people, and more importantly, to be transparent with people about what information you're working with and how you're making decisions going forward. So this is something that it becomes a part of the way we do business to get more equitable outcomes. Next. And so that looks like a lot of different things. We have to find new ways to connect to and talk to people, but also to think about the time and projects. This is a workshop that we did in downtown Brooklyn near the Farragut community, where the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway has a very long-term capital plan, and it's going to take 10, 20 years for this project to happen. So we thought, well, maybe we should go and talk to the kids that are actually going to be affected by this 20 years from now. And so designing ways to have more engagement and more learning in our process. Next. So in our current role, the kind of framework for the big issues of the city are obviously around affordable housing, and that's one of the things you hear over and over from people. How do we get more affordable housing and outcomes in our communities? And so the de Blasio administration, the current mayor's administration, developed a couple very high-level policy changes. One was mandatory inclusionary housing. This is the requirement that upzoned areas have a requirement for affordable housing, so big citywide policy. Another is a sort of a policy decision around how we develop and control city-owned property. So typically, city land would be RFP and sold to a developer. The city said, we're gonna pause on that, and for key sites, we're gonna maintain ownership of the land. Maintaining ownership of the land means Public Design Commission gets jurisdiction over what gets built on that land. Next. So what we developed were a sort of a resource and guide of what it means to develop good quality housing in these sort of transitioning neighborhoods throughout the city. So we started by doing research. So go back to that organization chart, right? Organize and learn. We did research for what are some good projects that we achieved affordable and low-income housing in the city while maintaining quality. Next. And so you can tap through these pretty quickly, but it's a number of different examples of real projects and research that we saw that were accomplishing good quality design, good neighborhood planning, and most importantly, creating the spaces and things that people in the neighborhood wanted to develop. So this is available on the Public Design Commission website, Quality Affordable Housing Guide, and I encourage you to look at these examples, but they accomplish things like 30% AMI housing, providing for community spaces, and integrated development. So this slide is where we took all of that research of things that we learned for real projects that met cost provisions, that worked with local planning and development, community processes, and again, went back to our process change and figure out how did those projects happen and how can we accomplish that again. So we developed this framework for looking at the development of new housing in the city and how we would align with different agencies to make sure that at each stage of those projects' development, we were able to sort of put together the goals and objectives at the right time for certain conversations, right? What income level a project is being targeted to is not a conversation that should happen way at the end of the public review process when it's happening at city council. That needs to happen earlier, right? That affects construction, that affects what's possible. So this kind of outline of process is really key to understand how we get more equitable outcome. Next. And so our sort of signature project that we really like to share with people about this is this project called the Peninsula. Some of you probably know about the South Bronx. The Bronx is burning. It's a very familiar kind of story in American urbanism. This is one of the sites of trauma, I call it, of the South Bronx. This is the Spofford Juvenile Detention Facility. It was a former kid jail. And a lot of horrible, horrible things happened in this facility for generations. The facility was closed, and obviously it became an opportunity for that community to think differently about what that space would be. Next. So this is it, right? This is kind of this physical piece of community that was an issue. Next. And so what happened in the sort of community process was that we started very early and talked to people, what do you want, what do you need? We knew housing was an issue, but what else was the community really talking about and looking for? Next. And so what was really great is that through that process, we learned that there are a lot of organizations, obviously, that were already doing work entrenched in that neighborhood, and they knew exactly what they need. They didn't need to develop, they already knew, right? So it was just the list. Next. And what was really great in this project is that it became the foundation, literally the foundation for this project. All the long unaddressed needs in this community became the stakeholders, became the anchors for the project. Housing was a part of it, but the community anchors was really the key. Next. And so that included everything from we need minority business contracting, we need space for these existing businesses that have very particular needs, and we need our housing to be developed at income levels that people in the neighborhood could afford. Next. So this is what was developed. So you answer all of that work, have a framework, put it out, and then this was the site plan that they had, and you'll notice that, you know, it's all great, but then they created this kind of inward-looking fortress of a place. This product that everybody talked about was actually an island and a thing in and of itself that served those stakeholders and those people. It wasn't necessarily for the neighborhood yet. Next. So what we did through that process was to figure out how do we make a better design and more equitable community by opening up that development and really creating these foundational programs to be really the heart of a new neighborhood that really connected and reached out to its fabric. Next. Next. And so this is kind of how it worked. So literally the ground floors of the development were light industrial space for small businesses, food-related and local business entrepreneurs to have shared kitchens, a local bank to serve financial services in the community. This neighborhood was a bank desert. Next. Public space anchored by the different kinds of community and social services, so daycares, space for artists, all kind of activating a public space that they wanted to make sure was active and not necessarily only for residents. And finally, a grocery and a community health clinic as sort of the other anchor. So all these things that the people in the community have been asking for decades were able to be the foundation of this project. Next. So this is some renderings of the site. Next. And that, you know, kind of from that human experience, from that pedestrian scale, the kind of the cornerstone and anchor are these things that people ask for. The workers' space, the open space and daycare as the heart of this community. And finally, you know, this image I love. So this is like the groundbreaking, which is actually the tearing down of that justice facility. So I say this is what justice looks like literally for this community. Next. Kevin mentioned in his intro like the flavor and life. So this is another development in downtown Brooklyn where it's the BAM Cultural District, and there's a large tower redevelopment. This is on top of one of the city's biggest transit hubs. So it's a big tower, right? It has inclusionary housing, but people were afraid of losing their flavor. Next. So this is some of the flavor. So for those of you who know Brooklyn, you know, think Spike Lee, Fort Greene, Brooklyn. This is at the Dance Africa Festival where people really come and activate the streets in this place. Next. And so the redesign of this development, people were afraid that it was going to be for new people, not for that community. And we designed it in a way that we could have all the different activities that exist and actually expand and augment those activities. Next. So this is kind of the rendering of what the government is then promising people. Nobody believes it, but then next. But then this is the reality. It's built, and because of design, because of conversations with people, upfront process, this brand new, you know, high-rise development in the middle of downtown Brooklyn has this as its space. Next. And these are conditions that can be designed, can be thought about. We call this image Black People Outside. Next. And that this space, despite it being a new development, still has a flavor, it still has the people, it still is comfortable for the people originally from that community. Next. And even, you know, when Dance Africa comes, now there's an expanded space for that street to have. And in downtown Brooklyn, as it's changed dramatically, these spaces still exist for that community. Next. So changing hats quickly. So that's a lot of my city work. I've done other work in Indianapolis, where I'm from originally. I'm originally a Midwesterner. And this is a history that is, I think, really interesting and important to talk about. There's an organization in Indianapolis called the Flanner House. It was a community-based social services organization that worked in the 30s and 40s. And this is a quote from one of their statements. It says, "What is it about? About people. They're about their needs, their abilities. It's about the food they grow, about the cities they live in." And it goes on to say, it's about what people know and don't know and what they ought to know to make America still greater. So this idea of kind of what it's about when you're doing these projects in community change is important to kind of think about how do you actually do this and accomplish this. Next. So one of those people working on this was this gentleman, Albert Allen Moore. He's my grandfather. And he was the agricultural and health director for the Flanner House. So he ran what was essentially kind of the Will Allen of his day, 100 acres of urban agriculture and urban gardening program to provide fresh and affordable food for people in the community. Next. So these opportunities provided for jobs for people who are unemployed, for young people. Next. For different generations. So they had food programs, garden programs, canning. This is my favorite image. They built a community center that they had a demonstration kitchen to teach people how to make healthy and affordable meals. So they thought kind of in a comprehensive way. And so one of the ways that they really did that, and kind of researching this organization that was wonderful, was that they took the time to understand the people. So on the left is a sociograph where they went and they talked to all the families in that community and understood what people know, what they don't know, and what they ought to know about their community. So after doing that, they were able to get people together. They identified leadership, capacity, deficits, all of those things. And they got together and and decided to build and rebuild and redevelop their neighborhood. So this is in 1940s Indianapolis. Call Indiana the middle finger of the South, Klan country. That black people were able to get together with support from Lilly Endowment, the Lilly Foundation, and they developed their own neighborhood. It had a park, had over 300 housing sites, community centers, and the housing was developed through self-help housing construction. So this is 30 years before Habitat for Humanity existed. They had sweat equity housing, so the people would get equity in their homes by building it. Next. So they built their homes, but not only did they build their homes, they built a whole neighborhood. So this is a neighborhood that was planned, designed, built by black people. Next. And so what's an interesting point of history is that this was happening during the time that the federal government, of course, is building public housing. So outlined in red is the Fall Creek Homes area that they redesigned and rebuilt. Outlined in orange is Lockville Gardens, which was one of the late 1930s segregated public housing developments built by the federal government. Next. So this is it and what they built ultimately, their own kind of community. And next. Now what happened is this community that they built was able to maintain over time. So you see the rest of the city had the highways, plowing through the black neighborhoods. The public housing had failures and was ultimately, portions of it were demolished. Portions that remain are, luxury housing. But this neighborhood that they built is still affordable in downtown Indianapolis. So that work of talking to people and getting a great development helps it sustain over time. Next. So inspired by all of that work, I've done a lot of work in my community. Next. Where the neighborhood where I grew up had a lot of vacant land, a lot of disinvestment. And so we had a simple idea, which was to improve our neighborhood. So we got a vacant house and a vacant lot and fixed them up for our community. Next. And then we did more of it. Buy another vacant house, buy another vacant lot, and redevelop it. So this is what it looks like. This is one of the long vacant homes, a lot of foreclosures, vacant properties. Next. Fix it up. That sounds easy, but it's not. Not easy because it's hard to do reconstruction projects, but it's also that hard because despite having an 800 credit score, I couldn't get a loan to refurbish a house in my own neighborhood, right? Redlining still exists. So I had to pull money off of all my credit cards to do this first project. Next. Other things that we were doing in the community were looking at all the vacant land and vacant spaces. So we've looked, and instead of just doing our own thing, we talked to all the people to see who was established, and there are all these folks that said, oh, well, we've been wanting to do a garden for a long time on this acre site, and we did this development of a community garden and a community mural. Next. An important part of this process was getting people involved in that work, local people, and really making a positive benefit. Next. So part of this work when we're doing the projects, we're doing local employment and hiring. So we hire people from the neighborhoods. Next. We do education programs. So we learn from the old Flanner House canning program. So we teach canning to get people connected. And then next, we do kind of these joint artwork efforts. And so these are projects where we're really acknowledging that you have a lot of different people that need to come together in the community to develop the changes happening in their community. So to wrap up, I'm going to sort of have a couple points. One, that there are positive things that can be done, but there are a lot of challenges. This image is very nondescript, but this is from Ville Platte, Louisiana. I've kind of outlined these two lines. You can go back to that image. Outline these two lines, and on this street, just regular American street, 3 teenage boys were walking down the street and were hit by a truck. They were generally okay, but they had to go to the hospital. Those kids that had to go to the hospital also were arrested because they were walking down this street without reflective gear, right? You see there's no sidewalk. Where else were they supposed to walk? So there is embedded injustice, inequality for a lot of people still in this country, and this has everything to do with the decisions that planners, designers, policymakers are making, right? Not having a sidewalk for these kids to walk down is an injustice that is built and designed, and there are a lot of people that were involved in those decisions, and you have to connect the dots that that is the case. Next. Next. And so a part of that work is figuring out how do we get more people to do and to think that way. So I'm also a part of a group of young professionals. I'm not so young anymore, but next, called Black Space. And actually there is a Black Space Chicago chapter, Black Space in the house. So these are people who are working on and thinking about how to improve outcomes and futures for Black communities, but also about the power and importance of the heritage and legacy of these communities. Next. And so we have people from all different disciplines. Some are artists, some are planners, some are economic development people, but we all are working in and with Black communities, and frankly working in the context of being Black people working in fields that are predominantly white and predominantly upper income. Next. And so this is around kind of figuring out a new method and way of practice. So we do work in and with communities. This is from a workshop we did with young people in the Brownsville, Brooklyn community in New York around heritage conservation. Historic preservation and historic districts are often associated with a certain type of place, but we were bringing that back to different kinds of communities and seeing how does that look differently to keep the flavor, to keep the culture of a place in places that don't normally have that kind of value associated with them. Next. And so the way that we've done that, and this is something that you can find online, blackspace.nyc.org is a website, but it's another manifesto, right? So I showed you the Flanner House manifesto from way back. This is another kind of a manifesto about how we do work. So create circles, not lines, right? So talking about the kind of embedded hierarchies that we all just by our training and by our environment kind of reinforce and fall into, to really be conscious about not doing that in every step, but to create circles that are more about inclusion, right? Sorry, go back one. Choose critical connections over critical mass. So in places that have, for example, disinvestment and depopulation, this is important. You may not have the historic critical mass that was in a community, the leaders, the capacity. So you have to think about, okay, what are the critical connections that you build to get that done? Move at the speed of trust, right? So Roberto talked in the beginning about trust. Trust has to take time in some cases. And so while development and policies and political timing and funding have certain kind of pace and timeline, you have to acknowledge that that timeline may need to be rethought and readjusted so that you can take the time to build the trust that's needed or establish the trust that is necessary. Thank you.